The Unconventional Therapist's Guide to Nothing.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Unconventional Therapist. I'm your host Dave, and I'm here with my co-host Greg. I don't like the way I entered that one. I'm your host, but then I said I have a co-host.
Yeah, come on, man.
That was weird. I got
Double trouble.
Double trouble.
That's right. Pop-O-Matic Bubble. You don't remember that game?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I hated that game. It's like noisy.
Stressful. Yeah, noisy, stressful. Not as noisy as Perfection was.
Perfection?
Perfection was the game for anxiety, I think.
What was Perfection?
It was when you fill the little holes with like the little pieces, but it's on a timer, and if you don't fill it up in time, it pops them all out.
And I'm like confusing it in my head with Operation.
Operation's stressful too.
Because it was like Operation, right?
Right?
Yeah.
That was stressful. All right, so listen, Dave, I got to talk to you about today's episode.
Why?
Because it's really hitting home with me.
Really?
Yeah, it is, and I'm going to explain why. So, as you know, I've been dealing with sort of a medical anomaly for the past couple of days, and I managed to not only get COVID, but COVID and the flu at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Why this episode's appropriate is I feel like I've been all walled up and stuck, and I couldn't go anywhere. I have no choice, and I'm just in place whether I like it or not.
Okay.
Now that makes sense.
You are comparing your quarantine with people who were literally in closed in like quarters, boxed in, buried alive.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
It feels like
you are drama.
I am. I am. And so today we're talking about immurement and premature burial. This, I'll take the claim for this one. I don't know how this is going to go, but this is a wild card, right? But it's something that fascinates me. Like, have you ever even heard of this?
Never before. It's funny. I never heard of it, but like, no, let me answer it differently. I never heard about it.
Okay.
I was going to say, like, I've heard sort of stories about it, but I never knew it was like a thing.
Yeah, so you've definitely heard stories about it, and we'll talk about that. But what it is just, it's simple. Like, it's being sealed inside a closed space, allowing someone to die slowly. Like, typically, I mean, it can be happening in a few different ways. Like, you can be walled in, like built into a wall, built into a structure, closed in a vault, whatever. It goes all the way back to ancient Rome. Actually, it probably goes back before that. Some sources say that the Druids would entomb people in trees as a sacrifice.
In trees?
In trees, yeah. Right in there.
Kind of cool.
Yeah, that is kind of cool.
Maybe like a hollowed out tree you put in there. Like, I wonder if they make little holes for the arms to come out.
In some of these cases, they do, which is
there's like arms coming out of the tree.
Yeah,
a little face hole.
It's really not. It's funny until there's bugs or weather or whatever, right? So this doesn't sound great. So usually this is a punishment or some form of sacrifice, but sometimes it's free will, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But you can be, like I said, stuck inside a coffin, or I think when I think about it, what's interesting to me is that the cases where you're just walled up, and I think that comes from the Cask of Amontillado, right? Mm-hmm. And that Edgar Allan Poe short story where Fortunato leads his friend, who's kind of like a rival, into the catacombs, and he's baiting him with a bottle of Amontillado, this like beautiful wine, right? And I just have like this little quote from the story, and this is because only Poe could write stuff like this. He says, "I resumed the trowel," and that's the thing you spread the little mortar with, right? "And finished without interruption the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the masonwork, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within, and that's it." That's right. So it's like you can picture like this poor guy in there, like watching himself being closed up, and the last thing he sees is like a little candle light, and that's the last thing the character Poe's talking about seeing too. So it's like it's this really dark thing on both sides where someone's committing this act and someone's dealing with it.
Mhm.
This like happens through a lot throughout history too, and it's a really scary thing.
Yeah, agreed. So it's interesting to think about uh, this topic of being walled in, because like when you start to delve into it, it goes in different directions, and I think you're gonna kind of break that down a little bit. But like, it's not just about punishment. There is like a use of it that's been used for punishment, but then there's also like some people who have voluntarily done it,
Mhm.
and we're going to talk about that later. There's just it serves different functions, I guess, and I just
It
find that
absolutely does.
fascinating. Yeah, so
Yeah.
like because you don't see that with any other like nobody's like voluntarily going on a bone stretcher or like other ways of like torture or execution. Like people aren't voluntarily doing that. So this one's a little different because it has different functions. And in one story it can be good, and the other story it's the exact opposite. It's like torture.
Yeah, because I think at first thought it's like it's awful and it sounds terrible, but then you're like, all right, so it there's this weird thing where you're taking away the most important thing that we have as humans, and that's hope, right? But in a sense, there's still some hope, I think, on some level. It's not like hey, look, you're gonna get hung, and there's a very like slim chance here for hope. But with this, it's like, well, you never know what could happen. Maybe there'll be an earthquake. I don't know. It's just something insidious about it. But let me talk about some of the ways that it's a punishment. Let's start with Rome, the Vestal Virgins. Have you ever heard of these ladies?
Yes,
Okay.
not
So they're
prior to this, but during the
yeah,
research, that's the
yeah.
first thing that comes up.
So beautiful young woman from important Roman families, which is an important little thing to remember there. Think of the girl in 300. Remember that movie 300
Yeah.
where yep, the oracles and there's like these nasty old guys and they would have these beautiful virgins, right? So they had to take a vow of chastity in order to keep a fire going, and the fire was in honor of the god Vesta. So ironically, Vesta is the god of home and family, and that's something these girls would never have because they're not allowed to give birth and not allowed to have sex. They're not allowed to have families, right? But these women were extremely important, and it was a huge crime to spill their blood. So if they became incelibate, something happened, maybe
Mhm.
they met a young gentleman, they would have to be executed, but they wouldn't be able to be executed in normal ways because it's illegal to spill their blood. So a room was built for them with a place to rest, some water and some food, and they'd be walled in alive. Beautiful young woman, walled in alive.
Yeah.
So in the Middle Ages, if a monk, it's sort of similar, right? If a monk or a nun, if they broke their vows, they would be kept alive in the same sort of situation, but fed through a small hole and never be able to leave again.
Yeah.
17th century Persia, thieves would be encased in stone all the way up to their necks, almost like the tree thing, but their head would be exposed. So like they're immured, but the only thing sticking out is their head. And this is so that birds and bugs and whatever could really just kind of grab at them. And the last one I'll mention as a punishment is, at the onset of World War One, so like 1914, 1915 timeframe, there was a punishment that was discovered in Mongolia, and it was this wooden crate that was custom made, right? So they would take like a Dave, like take you, and they would make a box for you just the right size where you couldn't sit down, right? So it's big enough for you to almost sit down, and it's big enough for you to almost lay down, but not quite. You could never get a full stretch. You could never really get
Horrible.
comfortable, right?
That's terrible. What a
It's like
terrible
my
thing.
worst. I
It's
sometimes think like when I see someone with a cast on their elbow, I'm like, how do you not stretch? How do you not just break that and stretch your arm
yeah.
out now? Like that
Yeah.
drives me insane.
Just to go back to the Vestal
Mm, virgin.
ones, the
Yeah.
goddess, they're like considered goddesses, weren't they?
Yeah, they're important.
So one of the reasons they chose this, I don't remember if you said this when you were just describing it. It's what would the word be? It's not allowed for them to kill them with their own hands.
Hmm.
So this was a way of killing them without actually having to put their hands on them. So
Exactly.
that's why
Yeah.
they chose this method of, like they'll die naturally.
Yeah.
And it's not us murdering them.
Quote
So
unquote naturally.
yeah, and that's like that idea that you bring up frequently about like that self-deceit, right?
Hmm.
we're doing this action to kind of justify an action that like inevitably we all know what the outcome's going to be.
Based on a
But
story we're not sure we really even believe, right? I mean,
right,
like
right,
it's just one of those weird things.
super
And
interesting.
it is interesting. So talking about those Vestal Virgins makes me think of, and maybe we should start talking about the human sacrifice element of this. So a fairly common practice in medieval Europe was to entomb people in the process of constructing things, like so bridges and buildings. There's this Russian poem called "The Building of Skadar," and it talks about a worker who has to wall up his bride in the construction of a fortress. This is like a common belief. I mean, for millennia, really, that a huge structure needed the sacrifice to make, like, it had to be given something to give it strength. And that was thought like the best thing that you give it was a human sacrifice. Like in Germany, of course, the Germans, no offense, but they would sacrifice children in the foundations of their castles because they made the castle invincible, right? And are these just urban legends, stories that you hear throughout? No, not really, because skeletal remains were found in the foundations after demolitions of some of these structures. So there's some truth to this, right? There's some truth to these little legends.
For the record, I am not German, so I'm not sure why you said no offense.
I feel like you look German.
I do not look German.
Okay. All right. So in 1906 in Morocco, you'll like this one. Hajj Muhammad Misfiwi was convicted of killing at least 36 women. So how do you punish someone for such a horrific crime? You wall them up. You wall them up and bury them alive. I mean, no one talks about this guy. 36 women murdered. That's like an early serial killer, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I would say so.
Not the earliest, I'm sure. Obviously not. Not even the earliest in America. I think H.H. Holmes would be that one. But interesting nonetheless. There's tons of these stories and poems about women who fall in love with the wrong man. There's always that story, right? And because they fell in love with this person and gave into their passions, they were immured and buried alive. So men have always been afraid of losing their ladies. This comes through a lot in these stories. Like if a woman who was married to the old prince or the old king, right, sleeps with his son, who's like, a much better match and they love each other or whatever, but she's, has to be with the king because that's the way he sees it, right? It has nothing about love. Then she has to be immured and walled in at 18 years old for falling in love with his son, instead of them being entitled to have their own love story. Yeah. It's something that happens. It goes on. So Dave, like
why do you think that they chose this for the sacrifice method? Do you think it comes back to that idea of like not having blood on your hands?
I think so. I was just gonna say, like, I think it keeps your hands clean in a sense.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's like, I'll do this and think on it, and if I'm given a sign or something reveals itself to me, then I can always untomb this person. And in most cases, which is human nature, you forget about people.
Maybe that's an important part of this. It feels, while it's probably not true, there's a part of it that feels like you can undo it. So like you said, maybe if like a realization comes, or there's a change of heart, maybe they could break the person out, or unimmure them. I don't know if that's a phrase. But it does feel like something that could potentially be undone. So that's an interesting idea about it.
That is, yeah, it's something really I hadn't thought of. Let's talk about it a little bit because I know that you, well, before we do that, you mentioned early on that there's some volunteer cases of this immurement. Like, who would volunteer to do this?
So can we talk about the anchorites? Is that what you're referring to?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So this is around like 11th and 12th century, kind of like in the medieval times, I guess it would be. Anchorites and anchoresses were men and women who chose to withdraw from secular world to live a life dedicated to prayer and the Eucharist. So they lived similar to like hermits, and they vowed to stay in one place, which was often a cell that was attached to a church. The word anchorite, which I've never heard before, derives from ancient Greek meaning to withdraw. So it's basically withdrawing from society, I guess.
It's a purification, right? It keeps you free from sin. Absolutely. I read this one case of an anchoress, and I was like, and I actually thought of you. I was like, Dave might do this, where like she became an anchoress, but her only rule was that she was allowed to bring her cat with her. And they let her, and she was like, yeah, man.
Pets. I would definitely bring some pets, and I'd be fine. I'd be totally fine.
Well, isn't it? Can't you talk to people too? Can't people come visit you?
So that's a part of it. So it looks different with them, the way they go about it. So they actually, their space can vary, but it's like, I guess for the most part, they said it was like an 8 square foot space, but some of them are larger. Some of them have like multiple rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And even like multiple floors, which is a weird thing to think about. So it's obviously it's not like as claustrophobic, I guess. And they would have like a table and a stool and a cutout in the wall so that they could, like you said, they would be able to communicate with people who came by, but also they rely on the people of the community to keep them alive. So they need people to bring them, like the clergy and whoever else, to bring them food.
Yeah,
and
like people are like, "Oh shit, did you feed the anchorite?"
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, their whole goal basically is to not be forgotten, which is like exactly the opposite of what you were saying about like the torture idea. Is like you eventually just forget about them; they're in there. So these people have to like stay in communication and make sure nobody forgets them, because otherwise, it's like, oh boy, now I'm done.
Yeah, so it's almost in a lot of ways, it's like the opposite.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Here's another really weird thing. So when they're building it, there's like a hole that's a pit that's dug, and they stand in the pit while it's being built, and that pit is also the pit that when they die, that's going to be their grave.
Wow,
that's weird.
Yeah, so they're like living. So they're going to be there for a while.
Yeah, they're
in life
doing this exactly. They're doing this just basically to die in there. And I was like, who would want to do this? Right? Well, here's who would want to do this. Some examples of people. It was like, it sounds like it was mostly like poor people.
Mm-hmm.
But there are like obviously exceptions where there's people who have wealth. Mostly females, but there are some males that do it. And it was also like, it sounds almost like it was a way of demonstrating repentance. So one of the examples is like women who were formerly prostitutes that were now looking for repentance would do this. Others might be like the wives of priests, which I thought was interesting because obviously, but like that's for like celibacy and probably to avoid temptation, I guess. Maybe on the priest end, he's like, you should go in there. I'm sure she didn't bring it up.
She's like, you need to go in there.
Yeah. Widows or abandoned wives, or people who like women who didn't have like enough wealth to have like a dowry to be married.
And was this like my understanding, I guess, it's like a guaranteed entrance to heaven, though.
Yes, that's like the thing that makes it, I guess,
worth it,
appealing. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, right?
That's what I mean. Like, it's the repentance. So if you did something terrible, you do this, and you're going to heaven. And it's also considered to be like an integral part of that society in medieval Europe at the time, and it was like you were considered to be like an example of, I don't know, piety, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah, well, look, sometimes you see this with serial killers too. It's a way to become known. It's a way, like you have an insignificant life, and now everyone knows who you are. Maybe that's something to do with it,
right? Right.
You know what? Like this, there's a brother to Immurement, or sister, or however you want to look at it, and I was going to start talking about some of the pop culture examples of Immurement, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about premature burial. Because
let me. I just had a thought, and I really want to like.
Okay, let it rip.
Throw this at you. Think about like the last week's episode was about homeless, right?
Mm-hmm.
Homelessness. And one of the biggest issues is like, where do they go? Like, what do we do with them? And not like it becomes somebody else's problem at some point when we have, a large population of homeless people because we don't have, you don't necessarily want them in certain spaces, right?
Yep.
So it becomes like stressful trying to figure out, well, where can they go? And like we're talking about, like this sounds like this was a lot of like poor people,
Hmm.
potentially people who would end up being homeless. It's almost a way, like it's almost like they deceive people into thinking that this is desirable to do to kind of get them out of the way.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I'm glad that you went that direction because I was like, I don't think this is the way we solve the problem of homelessness.
No, no, no,
Invite them
no.
all into a structure and fill it
I
up.
I just find it interesting that they I was saying how like they kind of consider it to be like an important part of the society. It's almost like tricking people into like thinking this is you should do this. It's like no, you should not do this. This is
Yeah, what a way
horrible.
to make someone appreciate, you know, life. I don't know. So I was just making me think of something really strange. Like, what if someone was agoraphobic and you were like, all right, you never can leave your house. You're afraid of the outdoors and whatever's out there. How about you can't leave your house? Do you think that changes their mentality? Do you think that changes their opinion? Or do you think they're like, good?
It's gonna do one of two things. Yeah, it's either gonna it depends, I guess, how oppositional the person is.
Hmm.
If they're very oppositional or resistant, they're gonna be like, no, you can't tell me what to do. I'm leaving my house. Or they're gonna be like relieved.
Yeah, it's like make the illness itself traumatic, you know? Like or sort of like if someone's like super depressed, like I can never leave my house. I can never leave my house. All right, well, we're gonna seal you up in this box forever. Now you're gonna want to leave. It's because you've made that depression traumatic. I don't know. I'm not making we're not making suggestions here. We're just, we're thinking. Um we better get onto that premature burial stuff before I start coming up with some interventions that people might
Okay,
not appreciate.
sure. Sure. So years ago, I was watching a show on the Vice Network, which I used to
Okay.
enjoy, and they had like this little, I forget what show it was, but it was like a little mini documentary. Oh, I do remember what the episode was, and there's actually a tie-in to a previous episode. They did an episode about the suicide forest, which
Oh,
we also covered. That was my first time hearing about that. In that same episode, they had a little segment about fake funerals. Now, South Korea, from what I understand, has a large population, not large population, a large suicide rate. And one of the things that they tried to do, there was this agency there that was trying to get people to appreciate their lives a little bit more and try to assist people with, getting them away from the, wanting to commit suicide. So what they devised was this idea of like setting up a fake funeral for yourself. And so far, over 25,000 people have participated in living funerals. One of the quotes that I read was once you become conscious of death and experience it, you undertake a new approach to life. So this is like a really interesting idea. It's kind of like going through these motions and seeing the process and imagining yourself being no longer with us kind of gives you a little sense of appreciation and motivation to want to live again. Kind of like what you were just talking about with what if someone didn't want to leave their house and we forced them to stay in their house, they might want to leave their house. They might get an appreciation for having that independence to be able to leave. So the whole process is the participants take funeral portraits, they create their last testaments, and then they lie in a closed coffin for about 10 minutes. Not
wow.
super long, but
Yeah,
if
long
you're
enough.
claustrophobic, I guess that's long enough. And it's supposed to have like pretty good effects on people. And, it's interesting because it's like, I think you would have to do it in order to truly wrap your head around what the feeling must be, the takeaway. Cause like in my head, I'm like, is really like walking through those steps going to make me feel any different? But apparently, the results are that people have actually been dissuaded from suicide because of it.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And you know, it's funny that you bring up the suicide forest because when we talked about, the Japanese ritual suicide, the seppuku, something
Yeah.
I don't think we mentioned was that I'm just remembering now is before the person killed themselves, because they knew it was in an honorable form, right? They knew they were going to do it. They were choosing to do it. And it wasn't because of depression. It wasn't because of anything else. So it's like this weird circumstance where they're in their right frame of mind. They're definitely choosing to do this. But they would write a poem, and the poem would essentially be about what's important about life. And you get that insight about what this person thinks about life right before they're going to die.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you're talking about there. It's like, all right.
And you know what? You just touched on the thing that essentially is the whole idea of this. It's coming to these conclusions, coming to these ideas sooner rather than later. Because another thing that they said happens a lot is we go to funerals, and that's where people tend to reconcile. So they might see a family member they had a falling out with, or a friend that they had a falling out with, and the loss of somebody tends to bring people together, right?
Yeah, you get to like reset what's important in life.
Yeah.
It's like you forget about all the things that you think are important for a little bit. Like just this week, I've been going through this with the flu and COVID, and it's like everything's so crazy, but like my family's healthy, and all I really want to do right now is taste the steak and cheese that they're all eating.
Yeah.
And I can't. It's like the little things become so important, and we let all those things go by, and we never have gratitude for them, and we have a hard time where we're forced to look at what's important. Like we can see that things that really are important, we most of the time we have already.
Yeah. I think death, experiencing the loss of someone else, no matter how close you are to that person, when you go to a funeral, you get a sense of like, I want to go out and live. Like I want to, like I'm seeing somebody's chapter being closed, and it makes me realize that mine isn't yet, and I need to fill up these pages.
Absolutely, 100%.
So that's what this is all about. It's about having a literal funeral, like alive, to come to these conclusions, where like the whole point is just basically to make these conclusions naturally, and be able to move on and reconcile, and understand that so many of our issues with others are petty and could be easily just worked out, but like there's something in us that blocks us from doing that at times.
Absolutely. So, geez, we get something profound from premature burials. I was thinking of, scratching the inside of a coffin and no, I'm not dead. Like this, like unintentional.
That is where my head went immediately, was like, I wonder if the process is about, like being buried alive and almost actually feeling like you're almost dying, but it's not. It's more about taking a step away from everything and just seeing that, like, so one of the things they say is like kind of understanding that if you're gone, you will be missed by someone. And then having people see that, and there's just so many messages in this whole process that are like really profound, I guess, and like deep and impactful.
A scary way to be buried early that people don't think about enough, like natural disasters. I remember I used to be freaked out about avalanches when I was a kid, or earthquakes, or what about 9/11? Being under all that rubble, they find like people, days later. Like, how are you surviving just sitting there immobile with hundreds of pounds of debris on top of you that you couldn't move yourself? You have to wait for someone to save you. Imagine that feeling.
Dude, imagine being at the bottom of a well. Like, I mean, it's like, I don't know if it's happened a few times, right? Obviously, we've seen it on the news, but like, imagine that you're just at the bottom of this thing you can actually see the sky, but like, there's no way you're getting out of that. That's like torture.
Like, remember Baby Jessica?
Yeah, no.
You don't remember Baby Jessica? That little,
maybe she ended up in a bottom of a well.
She was like a 2-year-old girl or something like that, very young, maybe 1.5. I don't know, but I remember this. We were young, but I kind of remember. And she, was playing around, walking, and she fell into a hole in the ground, and it took like hours and hours, if not days, to find her and get her out of that hole. And it was crazy. I can't believe you don't remember that.
It sounds familiar. Like I knew it was a story. I didn't remember the name.
Have you ever heard the story of Mary Hart?
Totally. Can't believe you're asking that.
I know.
Go ahead and tell everyone what's
okay. Well, it's a local story, so I'm not surprised that you know it. But she was this woman colonial times, early colonial times before this was a country, but here in, I want to say Connecticut. And she got really close with a family member. And, as things happen in the 1600s, most of the family died and it was just them. And it was just them for years and years and years and years and years until Mary died. And her aunt, it was her aunt, but they were very close in age. Her aunt, mourned at the funeral, was very upset, was very sad. And she has a nightmare that night that, she's inside of a coffin and she's scratching and she can't get out and she wakes up in a huff. And she's like, oh my God, that's Mary sending me a message saying that she's been buried alive and I need to do something about this. So she tries to convince everyone. No one's really buying it, but she's completely losing her mind. So people are just like, all right, let's humor her. Let's bring up the body. And when they did, they found all the broken fingernails and the face, was what they described as looking like it was just in pure dread, pure fear, terror, really.
Yeah.
And she was buried alive. And I wonder whenever I hear that story, I'm like, did her aunt wonder, was she like, am I going crazy or did I just see Mary move? Or I've known Mary for so long, she doesn't seem dead. I don't know. There's something there where it's like, did she know something? Or what do you think about that? Or was it just, maybe subconsciously she knew something, but she didn't really know it consciously. And so in her dreams, it came out and she had to do something about it. What do you think?
I have no idea. I have no idea. Is this do you remember what's the phrase about a bell?
Saved by the Bell.
Saved by the Bell, right?
Yeah.
And I was trying to look up around when that time was, and that's around the time of Mercy. You mentioned Mercy Brown and all that
Absolutely.
stuff.
Mercy Brown. Yeah, they would come up with all kinds of inventions for these things.
Yeah.
Glass panes, some kind of periscope type thing. It was a real fear because it happened kind of a lot, right? People go into comas. People, for whatever reason, seem unresponsive, but they're really still alive. And they get buried and they wake up and they're, oh my God, right?
Yeah.
Awful.
Yeah, imagine before we understood comas.
Jeez, I know. There's a lot of people. Pretty much everyone that ever went in a coma got buried alive.
Yeah,
that's what we know about comas.
That's crazy.
Until the 1800s, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just wild and just scary. Especially you waking up from. It reminds me of Kill Bill.
Yes.
Climbing out of that. Is that even possible?
I don't think so. But obviously it's a movie, so. And the whole point was to show that she could break the
1-inch punch or whatever.
Yeah, the 1-inch punch and be able to have that much force in your punch that you could break through. But yeah, that seems almost impossible, I would imagine.
And then the dirt starts rushing in, and it's this. I remember being a kid and I couldn't stand the feeling of a pig pile on you, being the bottom of the pig pile. I would freak out. And this is something I think a lot worse, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny. I don't know. Do you think you grow out of claustrophobia? I remember feeling way more panicked and anxious about enclosed spaces than I do now. Do you think that's possible?
I mean, sure, because you have more knowledge and maybe you can understand that you'll be getting out of it. But if you knew that you're going into a small space that you weren't going to be able to get out of, you could have some pretty good claustrophobic. When I think of people crawling into pipes or something like that, and you can't go backwards or you can't go side to side or you can't stretch out. I don't like that. I don't like that idea.
Even in the movies when they're escaping through vents and heating systems and stuff like that. It's oh boy, I would not want. But you know what? I think you're onto something with what you just said. I wonder if maybe it doesn't. You don't lose some of that claustrophobic feeling, but because you're older, because you can rationalize things better, you do have a better sense of all right, realistically, I'm not gonna suffocate in here, or I'm not gonna get squeezed to death. What makes claustrophobia? Is it is it panic because of feeling like you're getting squeezed, you're going to get squeezed to death? Is it panic over feeling like you're going to suffocate?
All those things. I'm sure it's some kind of evolutionary adaptation of going into the wrong cave. This cave's too small. Stay out of there, right? You want to be able to wiggle. You need some wiggle room. You need some space.
Yeah. I wonder what that is all about. That's an interesting one.
They all have their, well, I mean, here's the thing. If claustrophobia is technically an irrational fear, right? It's a phobia. That's what a phobia is.
Yeah.
But I don't know. We have it. We have it for a reason.
Like, have you ever heard of people being claustrophobic of going in like elevators?
So yeah, I don't love elevators.
Really?
always take the stairs.
Why?
Because who needs it? You know, being stuck in there like that.
You're not stuck in there though.
And then if
it's actually a pretty spacious area.
Yeah, the air runs out pretty quick. And let me tell you, if that thing you're on the top floor and that thing drops, you have to. My thought is, and I'm not a physicist, but at the last second, you just jump up in the air a little bit and you're all right.
Yeah, I think that's how it works.
Is that how it works? Yeah.
I know. I used to always have that thought about like, what if it just drops? I don't think I've had that thought in a very long time. Those are. It's interesting when I think about that because, like, I have a ton of fears.
Well, here's the thing: the elevator, right? Yeah. The most stressful part of the elevator ride is when you get to your floor, boom, it makes a noise, and then it feels like it takes forever.
Yeah, you're waiting for the door to open. Yep.
You're like, oh no, this is the time it happens. Great.
Yeah, I actually just recently was at a friend's. I was visiting a friend, and he has an elevator in his building, and for whatever reason, there was this like pause, and we were pushing buttons, and the buttons weren't like lighting up, and the door had already closed, and I had a brief moment where in my head I was like, "I'm on here forever."
Yeah,
we're stuck. We didn't even like lift up. So like if we could have broke the door open, we would have been fine. But in my head, it just immediately went to worst case scenario. We're never getting off of here. I don't even know like if I have service to be able to call 911.
So this is why you're recording the podcast from elevator.
Right? Yes, currently.
Yeah. Someone will find you. I'll send help.
It's like the escalator. You know, I used to always have a fear that my shoelace was going to get caught in an escalator. I don't even think about my shoelaces in escalators these days.
No, me neither. It's almost like you would have this irrational fear that the escalator can like eat you up at the bottom, like suck you into that little thin space.
Yeah.
That's not happening. Let's talk about pop culture a little bit because there's some interesting stuff here.
You already mentioned Poe.
I did mention Poe. The Simpsons had an interesting one.
Poe, he's really hot in pop culture these days.
Oh yeah, well he kind of is, right? With
yeah.
What is it? What was it? The Mike Flanagan thing, Fall of the House of Usher.
Mm-hmm.
So here's one: Thomas the Tank Engine in a 1984 episode. Henry, who I know these trains and I know them by name because of my four sons.
You've named all your kids after Tom. I didn't realize this.
No, although ironically, the youngest son's name is Henry Thomas.
I know.
So he's covered here. So Henry the train, he's immured for being. This is a tough word. Recalcitrant. So I had to look it up, and it means having an obstinately uncooperative attitude towards authority and discipline. So in 1984, the big message here was like, you better listen up or you're gonna get freaking walled up and be useful. Now, if you're taking away the train's ability to move, like you're taking away all its usefulness and all its purpose, and pretty dark, don't you think?
I didn't know Thomas the Tank was around in 1984.
Either did I. Apparently, it was pretty. So there's some pretty dicey episodes. It was controversial to start with, I guess. Maybe it was an adult show to start.
Yeah. It was on HBO.
Yeah. London Bridges, the little London Bridges falling down. What is that? A nursery rhyme?
Yeah.
You know, like we said before, according to ancient thought, you know, it's a bridge would fall or a building would fall if it wasn't for sacrificing its foundations. So bodies were found beneath the London Bridge, and they think that song is about immurement. And I looked up some of the lyrics, and it's kind of tough to decipher, but it could be.
Now, a lot happened at London Bridge.
Yeah, it could be Viking.
There's some like people being held captive there, right? There's like prison there or something along those lines. I can't remember the entire history. That's that might be a thing that we delve into at some point because there's some history there. It's
very interesting. Yeah, it is. Did you ever see that movie Buried with Ryan Reynolds?
I didn't watch it.
It's stressful.
Yeah.
Just being buried alive. There's a lot that goes with that. Well, now I know you've seen this movie, Man in the Iron Mask. I know that's not Immurement.
I never watched the full thing. I know of it. I haven't watched it. Is that Leonardo DiCaprio?
Yeah, and I read probably for 45 minutes about that story, and I won't get into it because I think it could be its own thing. It is fascinating. Like Louis the 14th, some people think it's his twin brother, other people think it was like this, a financier or, a rival or whatever, but someone who showed the king up, it's just no one was allowed to see his face again. Can you imagine that? Wearing an iron mask for the rest of your
Yeah,
life. Tough.
that'd be awesome.
Yeah. And of course, Blanche Monnier and Count the Blood Countess Bathory, both previous episodes, so people can take a look at that. And one more pop culture reference: Seven. Sloth, was that Immurement? Do you think?
He was put in a wall.
No, but he was. I think he was tied to the bed and left in a room to rot.
So we're getting really casual with
Yeah,
the
we are.
term immurement. So isn't immurement actually like the act of putting someone in a wall, though?
Yeah,
So does that answer the question?
yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah,
He's captured and tied up.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't
And the
know.
same with Blanche and Bathory, correct?
No,
Neither of
Bathory
them.
was immured.
She
Bathory,
was immured. All right.
she
I
was one
couldn't
of these
remember that.
cases where, like what you were talking about, she had maybe a couple floors. She had a beautiful little space,
Okay.
but her crimes were so horrific, bathing in virgin's blood, that they did wall her up so that she would never. And it wasn't one of those things where you can go talk to her. She was just walled up in part of the castle, and that part of the castle was forgotten. She
She
was
got
left.
the Al Capone cell.
That's right. That's right. Do you think? Oh wow! And if her bones were still there, that'd be incredible. But that's about all I can think of on Immurement. Can you think of any final thoughts for this thing?
I think that trying to wrap our heads around why this seemed like it was so popular and today it is not a form that's used. Like, what do you think about that?
I mean, we do. How different is the prison system? It's
So,
solitary confinement.
yeah, I was just gonna say, like solitary confinement. You think about like any type of cell that it's more like a door with a window. I've seen some pretty wild stuff as far as like those type of rooms go too. With like when I've gone into like some of the abandoned asylums and things like that,
Mhm.
and actually seeing that, it's like kind of crazy to think about being so like some of those are like bottom floor halls. It's kind of dark. And then the doors just like a hallway lined with these doors with like, they're old doors with like this little hole window. And it's just like, imagine being in there for any duration of time. I don't know. It's something to think about. And we've moved away from a lot of this stuff,
Yeah. Thank
but
God.
yeah. And is it because we're realizing that it's not really humanistic? I don't know. What is,
So is it the worst form of execution? So it's definitely not the most painful, although I'm sure being like dying of dehydration and starving and going insane and losing hope and having to sit there in your thoughts and knowing that this is it. Is that the worst? If you're walled up in a tiny little space, like in the Casco Amontillado, right? That tiny little space where you can't even move. Like the guy in the box who can't sit down and be comfortable. He can't lay down and be comfortable, but he is going to live for the next week.
yeah.
Like, is that or longer? If because they keep a hole in the box and so you can get water. I mean, they can keep you alive for a little while in those things.
So I think the thing that people realized over time, and I think that like, well, there's an idea that maybe they stopped doing this stuff because of it's not right to torture people, but like we do have different torture things that still exist today. I think in actuality, it's more about it takes a lot of effort to keep someone alive.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're not. This whole process isn't about letting a person suffer and starve to death. It's about keeping them alive and allowing them to suffer in isolation, and that is pricey.
Yeah, and the other right. So that's kind of what we're doing now. But and then there's that other side of immurement with those cases where they just wall you up and leave you, and you know that you have to sit with that idea that you're not. There's no hope for you. You
No,
are
that's
you are dead.
starvation, and just that's death. But like we don't have a form of that, I would say. It's more like this idea that we keep someone alive just to allow them to suffer, but that's work and money. So I think that's
Yeah,
why they move away from that,
right.
I would assume.
Crazy stuff, though, huh?
Yeah.
Why is it fascinating, or is it fascinating to you?
I mean, I wouldn't like seek out this topic, but like it was interesting for a week.
Yeah. Okay. I like it. I don't know why I like it, but I do. There's something about these. I don't know, because if you can put yourself there and think like, oh my god, how did people survive this? Even in the witch trials, when they talk about their cells and how they couldn't lay down, they couldn't sit down, they were just small enough where you could stand there. Yikes! I guess I don't like the idea how uncomfortable it must be
Yeah.
in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So there's the claustrophobia element, like you're right about that, and then there's the hopelessness and the cruelty, the isolation. It's just everything horrible. The darkness, you'll never see the light again.
Right.
Yikes. Yeah.
Okay.
Huh?
All right. Well, that is
Hmm.
our little deep dive on immurement and premature burial.
That's right.
All right.
Topic everyone needed for this Christmas season.
Absolutely. Totally relevant to Christmas.
Yeah.
Or the holidays, we should say. All right. Well, there are a couple more weeks left to the holiday season. So we are probably going to get into some holiday stuff. And then we got New Year's Eve coming up. So we do like to do our themed topics. So you can look forward to those in upcoming weeks. And, just in general, as always, I know we've been saying this a ton, but we do appreciate the messages, the kind messages that we've been receiving, the thoughtful responses from people, the suggestions people have been throwing out. We got a recent person was engaging with us, Brandon, and he had thrown out some pretty amazing ideas and just his feedback. Interesting, Greg. I know we talked about this a little bit already, but like we're getting a lot of like grad school listeners, and I really appreciate that, because I mean, we get it, and I think that I can understand why people appreciate maybe the takes that we're coming with as far as like on some of these topics that grad school people might find interesting.
Yeah.
Because like so much of what we were doing during grad school was so serious. And sometimes you needed or just wanted a lighter approach on something.
Or like just explain this tell me what I need to know about this.
Yeah.
What's useful about this? I think we should do more topics like that. I've been pushing Freud down your throat, so maybe you'll and that was Freudian in a sense.
Yep, that was
oral fixation.
Yep.
We could get into that.
All right, Craig. See you later, dude.
All right.
Okay, everybody. All right. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. As always, if you have the time and the energy, we appreciate leaving a rating or review. Let us know your thoughts and help us get this whole podcast out there for the mass audience. And as always, we hope that you guys have a great night and a good weekend and a good week and just a good life in general.
Yeah.
Just keep it real, dude. Have a good life.
I like it.
Peace out.